Ted, let me go to you first on this. When you hear what the Attorney General has to say, what do you think?
Well, of course, Scott, I mean, he's obviously carrying water for the Obama administration, for the Democrats. Here's what I think is most interesting about this, is that we've got a law on the books that basically says that every time Texas changes anything, we change our maps, we even change our voting locations, we've got to go on bended knee to the federal government under the Civil Rights Act. And I think what the question, and obviously the Supreme Court is now looking at reviewing what the maps look like, and I think that the Supreme Court may actually take a big look, a big ball look at whether or not the federal interference in our elections is really what our state needs going forward.
Well, straight to that point, Glenn, is that what our state needs?
Well, let's take a look at why there's such a thing as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's because of the century-long history of southern states, including Texas, discriminating against minorities and the poor. It didn't come out of nowhere, and it wasn't done just for federal interference. It was done because there were laws in place, poll taxes in place, thugs at the polling places that kept people that they didn't want to vote from voting. So there was a real reason to protect the voting rights of Americans for that act to exist, and unfortunately, some of those reasons still exist. So if we're going to talk about whether to scrap the Voting Rights Act, which, by the way, was authorized and reauthorized and signed by George W. Bush just 6 years ago, well, then let's talk about it. But I think you couldn't pick a more regressive, anti-democratic position to take. I'd be happy to debate that anywhere in America.
Well, I want to go back to Ted here in just a second, but let me draw that out a little bit, Glenn. You said there's reasons that still exist, like what?
Well, I mean, obviously, let's take the new voting ID law in Texas now. Let me make one thing clear. I'm actually way against a voter fraud and want to prohibit it.
Yeah.
Holder's ideas articulated last night that we have automatic registration of eligible voters could include an ID, but it would eliminate these irksome problems like we face. There's a woman in Wisconsin named Ruth L. Frank, been voting since 1948, born at home in 1927. It will cost her upwards of $250 to get the documentation, to get the ID. Now, the government shouldn't ask a citizen to pay $250 to vote. Those are the little problems we could eliminate. Give people automatic registration so that more Americans can vote, eligible citizens can vote, but not put the burden of the cost on them, which is just another poll tax.
What about that, Ted?
Well, look, I mean, I think that when people understand you have to have a voter ID to rent a car or to cash a check, most people are just surprised that you don't have to have a photo ID to vote already. So I don't really buy, I mean, there's this kind of like small anecdotal evidence that's going to cost some money. We already know that the United States Supreme Court has looked at the Indiana case, has looked at voter ID laws, and has deemed them to be constitutional. But let's get back to this issue. Glenn's right. Our state and 16 other states that are under the Voting Rights Act, many of them have very difficult and shameful histories of racial discrimination. But it's 2012. It's not the 1960s. And to have to go to the federal government every time we change an election or do something small, it's part of our history, and it's time to make it part of history. The Supreme Court has an opportunity to do that, and conservatives, I think, would applaud their big step in making the next step in racial conciliation, which is putting the Voting Rights Act part of history and understanding that our lawmakers, when they draw districts, they're trying to draw districts that represent the people of those areas without racially discriminating.
Well, I want to press that point about whether or not we need to go back to Washington every single time we make a change, but let's first do traffic and weather on News 92 FM. It is 9:49. Somehow we lost Ted there. If you could get him back, Memphis, I'd appreciate it. But I do have Glenn on the line. Glenn, you heard before the break that Ted was saying that, look, we shouldn't have to go back to Washington and ask them for permission every single time we make a little change here and there. The voter ID law notwithstanding, because that's certainly not something that's little, but for everything to have to go back to Washington and say, is this okay? He almost feels like it's begging to have to do that.
Well, I mean, it's just complying with the law. It's not begging, and there's no bended knee involved. And here's the reason. What's the most important institution in a democracy? It's the right to vote. Everybody should have an easy access to the ballot box and be able to vote as long as they're qualified, eligible citizens. Why would we put any barriers in the way of a single American to exercising? The Voting Rights Act was intended to maximize that right, which once again I'll say there is nothing more holy in a democracy than the right to vote. What Ted Delisi and other Republicans should do is join with us in making certain that every eligible American citizen can exercise that right. If you begin to diminish it, you diminish and crack the foundation of democracy. We can't afford to do that.
And I think Ted...
Those are lofty words. There's no
Ted is back with us, as you can hear.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Those are lofty words. But, my point is this. There's nothing more precious than the right to vote. And I think when you look at if you ask people, do you think it is a reasonable requirement that there's nothing more important than the right to vote, and there's nothing more important than the integrity of that vote? I agree with Glenn. We want as many people to come and participate in the legislative process and vote and cast their vote as they see it. But we also want to have votes that are secure. We also want to have the integrity of our elections. And we know that the Supreme Court has said that having a voter ID, having a photo ID, and making sure that that photo ID is something that people understand. This is the person who's casting this ballot. This is the person who's doing this. They can't go run around the county and vote 5 times. We know that we have efforts in our elections to make sure that our ballots are we don't just have a lot of turnout, but we have a lot of integrity. But those things go together to make sure we have trust in democracy. You can't have one without the other.
Yeah, and Glenn,
so why don't you join with me and say let's do it in a way nationwide where the government helps every eligible citizen get that necessary ID. I'm not that opposed to an ID, but we could make sure that ID gets in the hands of every eligible voter. We're not doing it that way. The Texas law doesn't do it that way. The Wisconsin law and the Indiana laws don't do it that way. I would point out, by the way, that
one at a time. Glenn, finish your thought.
That Indiana law, the appeals court decision, right, that went to the Supreme Court for approval, and it was approved, was written by a guy named Richard Posner, who has an entire book written on the premise that voting simply isn't that important in a democracy. He says our more important duty is to shop, and that paying attention to politics may get in the way of our commercial work.
Well,
and that's the theory behind these voting ID. Let's do it the right way
Ted,
instead of a way that disenfranchises voters.
Ted, I got about 20 seconds. I'll give you the last word. Go ahead.
Well, I think at this time of year, shopping may be more important than voting for a lot of people. But I will say, hopefully next year, next year it won't be, and it won't be next year. But the important thing is, Glenn and I agree, the integrity matters. The Supreme Court says it's constitutional, and let's let the Supreme Court do its job. They're the rule of the land when it comes to these constitutional issues.
All right, that is Ted Delisi. He is a Republican consultant there in Austin. Also, Glenn W. Smith, who is a liberal commentator and also a Democratic strategist. You can find him at dogcanyon.org.